If I remember correctly, The Tyranny of Structurelessness is the title of a book written by Joe Freeman, a feminist who emerged from the second wave of feminism, so 1960s-ish. So, Una, what have you got to tell us about it?
So The Tyranny of Structurelessness, it's more of an article than a book, I'd say. It's quite short, so you can read it, in half an hour or something. It was written in the 70s, and it quite specifically references the feminist movement in the US, and it's talking about the tendency of a lot of the feminist groups at the time to try and have groups that are so-called structureless. And she talks about this as kind of a reaction to a society that obviously is very structured and full of hierarchy, and those hierarchies often having a really detrimental impact on women, or often just totally excluding women. But she goes on to critique this idea of structurelessness. And I think a lot of us who have been involved in activist groups or organising that are kind of in sort of anarchisty spaces, or the more autonomous left, you might call it, have experienced various versions of people attempting either structurelessness or lack of hierarchy. And so what she talks about in the article is this idea of structurelessness, like having it very informal, not lots of rules, trying to make the hierarchy flat, can work really well for consciousness raising groups, which is what a lot of these feminist groups started off as. So places to share your experience and kind of reflect on feminist thinking, feminist writing, and apply that to your own life. But it got really difficult when it came to those groups actually wanting to do stuff. And that is, there's a number of different problems that Joe Freeman goes over in the article, but a few of the main ones are, the main one is the fact that no group is actually structureless. So every group will have a structure or some form of, maybe not hierarchy, but like a structure. The only thing you're really doing when you call it structureless is just hiding that structure and making sure that no one actually explicitly knows what it is, and it can't be explicitly challenged. So she says that basically, in order for people to be able to participate in a group, the structure and the rules of the group must be transparent. Every group is going to have structure or rules, whether they're informal or formal. And the only thing we do by pretending that we don't have them is just make it impossible for some people to participate, because they're not able to kind of read those implied rules just from being around them. And she talks about the impact that this has on kind of allowing groups to become quietly dominated by, she uses the term elite, defines that, less as like deliberate, shady group of people and more as a group of friends who happen to be friends and therefore will like listen to each other, back each other up, tend to dominate a group. I would probably slightly challenge that idea of it being like a group of friends. And I think it'd be more sensible to look at things like class background or race or other things that make people behave in a similar way, or make people kind of naturally sympathetic towards each other's ways of communicating and behaving. She goes through like a few other problems with trying to have structureless groups. And one of the ones that I found really interesting is that when you have a group that declines to have official spokespeople, you end up with the media kind of turning to what she calls stars, so unofficial spokespeople. You can see this all the time in current activism, where it's like the people with big Twitter following, the people who kind of gravitate towards being in public and speaking about things, often end up being spokespeople for movements or spokespeople for whole groups of people with no structure for them to be accountable to those people. And then you see a cycle where, then this is something that she talks about in the article, you see a cycle where because of that lack of accountability, the people that spokesperson is speaking for become resentful of the person and then can turn on them. And then the experience of that person can be really awful. And then that further erodes any connection between them and the movement and any accountability there. And I think we see that cycle all the time. And I don't think that cycle is confined to the more autonomous left or groups with an anarchist background, but I do think the reluctance to have structured, formal ways that we communicate can lead to that cycle more quickly. Another really interesting problem that she talks about, which again, I think I've seen time and time again on the left and have also been part of, is that having an informal structure and informal processes and not having those laid out anywhere means it's really hard to engage in healthy, open conflict. If you haven't got a clear, transparent way that this group is functioning, it's really hard to actually challenge the way the group is functioning. And it's really hard to have conflict in a way that doesn't feel personal or doesn't become personal. And what she says tends to happen is that because engaging in open, healthy conflict would require the elites of each group to be transparent about the structures and processes, they don't tend to do that. They tend to turn towards more personal ways of othering their opponents. And I think anyone who's been involved in organising will have seen that process play out where instead of kind of being open about whatever power structures might actually exist in the group, even if they're not formal, people will turn to ways of excluding the people who might be challenging them or opposing them. Those are a few of the problems. There's more that she talks about, but those are the ones that I found really interesting and felt that really resonated with my experience as well. And she goes through a list of principles that she thinks groups should adopt for a democratic structuring. And I think here she's trying to kind of get that balance between having something that's like really, really hierarchical, really overly structured or really overly formal, but then also making sure that there is an explicit structure. So I won't go through these in loads of detail, but she talks about delegation, making sure that tasks are specifically delegated to people, that those people have a responsibility to carry out those tasks and are accountable to the people who have delegated the task to them. Distribution, so trying to distribute authority among as many people as is reasonably possible. It's an interesting one because a lot of the so-called structuralist groups will say they have a flat distribution of authority, everyone has equal authority, but it's very rarely that that is the case. It's just the people who have authority don't officially have authority, so it's quite hard to challenge that authority. Rotation, so rotating responsibilities so that they don't become the sole property of one person. Allocating tasks according to kind of ability, interest, and responsibility, and also having structured ways for people to learn how to do tasks. Diffusion of information, so lots of information to everyone as frequently as possible. I've got some thoughts on that one, but won't go into it now. And equal access to resources, so making sure that everyone in the group has equal access to resources like rooms or equipment, and also the skills and information of other members. So you need to set up structures that make sure that people can access all those things. So I'll stop there, but that's a kind of general overview of the article. I think there are critiques that can be made of the article, but I found it like a really, really useful, short, accessible way to think about a lot of the problems that happen in informal organizing groups.
Yeah, absolutely. It's super relatable. You know, those with the most capital end up dictating a lot of many things. And it's always like the same two people doing X, Y, and Z because, of course, it's the same two people doing X, Y, Z. Because I think often the argument made, in my experience, has been, oh, well, we've done it before. We know what we're doing. You know, we need da 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 da. And yes, but that's because you don't have a structure in place to address that problem.
Well, I absolutely do not recognize any of that at all. As someone who was an ardent adherent of structurelessness, and I wonder why that was, as a white, confident fella with plenty of time on my hands and the social capital to essentially implicitly manipulate any group that I was in. I wonder why I was such an adherent to structurelessness. I remember reading that article, and again in the late noughties, and I was like, oh, fuck. Because I was like, oh, there's so many things about what you've said that it's hard to pick out all the things that I like. Yes, that's so true. So I want to hear more about what your thoughts are on the diffusion of information, because you've got thoughts on them and I want to hear them. But I'll say some stuff in support of structurelessness, or in support of quote unquote flat way of organizing. Now, for the listener, they might not know what we're talking about here. Like one of the most famous examples in recent history would be the Occupy movement was kind of organized like that, or Climate Camp and the anti-globalization movement. Also squatters movements. I think elements of Black Lives Matter lacked structure, explicit structure, some elements, and direct action groups, so people who go out and shut down motorways or things like that. Those are the kind of groups, and they kind of have like a quote unquote consensus decision making style. And so look, this is super opaque. It's really difficult for you to get into. You don't know how it works until you're part of it, and then once you're part of it, you're like, great, I'm part of it, this works, you know. So I recognize all of those critiques, but what had come before had been very centralized. There's a central committee, and basically they were explicitly or implicitly organized as armies. There's leaders, there's generals. You do what the leaders and the generals tell you to do. They know best, and that's how we maintain tactical unity. And of course, those leaders didn't know best, because what human beings do, and led us repeatedly, especially during the 80s, I think was a nadir at this point, of just repeated defeats. But I think a really classic defeat in my lifetime that I remember was these movements that were a lot more effective, that were horizontal, that were without structure, were like the roads movement. They stopped 90% of roads in the UK being built, the biggest road building program since the Romans, right, it was called, and stopped genetically modified foods, and won loads of anti-corporate campaigns, and founded things like No Sweat and blah, blah, blah. And then the invasion of Iraq came along, and the centralized groups said, hey, we've got this one. we'll take control, and said, just trust your leaders, okay? We're all going to take you on a march around London, the biggest march in British history, 2 million people. And it didn't do anything, right? So what should we do now? Oh, we'll go on another march. It was 1 million people. We'll go on another march. It was 500,000 people, 250,000 people. Ended up, I went on a march that was 10,000 people. It was ever decreasing numbers. And all I'm saying is any critiques of this should not lead us back to that way of thinking or organizing. It was repeated failures, and also extraordinarily depressing and lacking in joy, those organizations as well. At least as messy as structurelessness is, where there's no structure in the organization, at least there's something dynamic and weird about it, you know?
I think that's a really important context because, you know, for me, reading this, I was kind of acutely aware of my age and my specific experience. And, you know, I'm in my 30s. I started getting involved really with political activism around the climate camp movement in 2008, 2009. So my engagement with politics has mainly been through these more non-hierarchical groups. I wouldn't actually call climate camp a structureless group because there were structures and there were difficulties with those, but I do feel like there was an attempt to make clear structures in that organization. But yeah, it's really easy for me to kind of look at articles like this and be like, yeah, this is structural systems, complete nightmare, like let's have some like sort of regimented hierarchy. Like I feel like I came out of the autonomous left with just like a yearning to have a position and just be told what to do and do something that feels useful and like continue on with that. So it's really useful to have that counterpoint to it, or the historical context around why this stuff emerged. That's why I find in this article the principles of democratic structuring really helpful, and the emphasis being on that democratic thing, because I feel like a lot of the ways that those more hierarchical organizations, like the ones that I have had experience of being in the same organizing spaces as groups like the Socialist Workers' Party, where it's felt to me that there's a sort of lack of interest in the democratic bit and an emphasis on the structured bit. These principles are quite a useful basis for getting a balance between those two.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. I can also recognize a lot of the problems with structurelessness and then the tyranny of structure as well, I guess. Well, the tyranny of certain kinds of structures, very hierarchical, top down. One thing that sort of sprung to my mind that connects to an issue we discussed in an earlier podcast was the fact that all of this requires so much time, which is really tricky. I think I would like to be told what to do and just given a rule book to follow. That would be so much easier. But I also feel like, yeah, those organizations that do that, they're not as strong as they need to be to face the challenges that they need to face. So how do we deal with that whilst also recognize that people are so stretched? A lot of people aren't going to have loads of spare time. And then time becomes a barrier. Like if you haven't got the time to go through these principles and put them into practice, let alone to not go through the principles, but to learn the unwritten, well, I suppose it must be easier if they're written down. In theory, because some people are only going to have like an hour a week where they can spare. And what do you do with those people? We were talking last week during our team training day about projects around mutual aid and collective support that sprung up around COVID, and how helpful it was. What felt successful about those projects was that there were clearly defined tasks, clearly defined roles. You could just volunteer or give your time for a really small set period. And it was still really valuable to have those people's time. But it wasn't saying, look, if you can't learn all the ways of organizing and if you can't contribute in the shaping of the decision-making process, let alone the decisions themselves, but even in the decision-making process, then you're not really going to be able to join the organization. And that sort of barrier to entry was a lot lower. On the other hand, to remake societies and reorganize our communities, we do need everyone invested. We do need everyone having more power. Are there any examples people can think of where we look to those successful versions of those changes that are both at the right scale but also address the problem and don't make it too much of a barrier to get involved?
That was definitely one of the big questions that came up for me while reading it. And that was part of my thoughts around this diffusion of information. And I think that's part of like the time that this article, this article was written in the 70s. We now live in a world where there's so much information all the time. And I was just like, when I read like the idea of the diffusion of information to everyone as frequently as possible, I was like, no, please don't do this to me. But I think that's part of this question around what about those people, which is most people who don't have loads of time on their hands to go and sit in meetings, to read all the information, to be hyper involved. To be involved in these informal groups, you pretty much have to be all in. You've got to be at every meeting and you've got to be involved in every decision because there's no division or kind of delegation of things. And then sometimes there's like another problem where even if you're not really doing anything or you're not that involved, you can still turn up to a meeting and have a huge opinion on something and totally block it or propose an idea that no one's going to have capacity to put in place. And so that's a big question for me around how do you, when you're creating an organizing structure, make sure that the people who really, really need to be involved in the strategy, who are going to be the people with like the least time on their hands, because they're going to be the people most affected by the problems you're trying to address, are able to engage in the strategy without having to give their lives over to very boring meetings.
It's kind of bringing me back a little bit to a conversation I had about how we can have structure. I remember the term diagonal and diagonalism, right? Because I guess it's trying to find this in between and address the fact that we do want structure, but this structure can come in the form of delegations and outlined roles that people take on. And again, that rotational aspect that you brought up that was also mentioned in that essay by Joe Freeman. But I mean, an example I can think of immediately is the way that the Zapatistas and autonomists, they don't call themselves anarchists, so I won't call them anarchist group and movement. They have, and they most significantly had the spokesperson of Subguana de Marcos, and we've spoken about that in a past episode, but there's an example of where that is an outlined role, but he was accountable to everyone involved as part of that liberation movement. And as much as he may have been designated a quote-unquote leader, he wasn't a campesino, a peasant. He was not indigenous. He studied in the UNAM and the Autonomous University of Mexico, so he was this well-spoken university level educated person. So his role was obviously very different within that movement. I think we can learn a lot from the way they organize still, because they do have structure and they do have some elements of consensus, but when it comes to decision making, they don't throw out majority completely, because these are really large groups and flexibility is required, and we cannot always be so committed to ideas that aren't always helpful, because consensus in a group of 5 is fairly easy, believe it or not, but consensus in a group of 100 is stretching it sometimes, you know. And so then I look to groups like Radical Roots, for example. Cooperative of cooperatives is what I would kind of call them, but they're essentially this network, this mutual aid network of people, right? And they do have very structured but horizontal forms of organizing, which I think you could designate as diagonalist perhaps. And they have the 12-1 consensus where every cooperative has a vote of 1. It's a structure that is able to continue because it's not surrounded by campaign. It's very long term and it's always going to be there. And there's always going to be this space for rotation, because when it comes to campaigning and it comes to things that are very immediate, we don't have those spaces necessarily to be able to diffuse information, to have the time that is necessary, because we are acting in the moment. The best thing we can do is really just invite people along, and you learn by doing, you learn by getting used to things. And I didn't learn what consensus decision making was because of some explainer that someone gave to me. It was because I found myself in a space where that was just kind of happening. And so I guess is how you might get introduced to certain ideas. But as you said, like there's this level of commitment that people do not have and cannot have. It's really goddamn impossible to actually get involved, and it's led to a point where I'm definitely not involved anymore in a lot of campaigning, a lot of activism, a lot of movements, because either you're there or you're not. It's all in, and it's not something that's sustainable whatsoever. So we can create structures and places where that is in fact sustained, centers where that's sustained, groups where the intention is to be a long-term group, where we can have very clear cut out structures. But how do we use those spaces, and how do they work alongside campaigns? How do they work alongside actions and things that need immediate response? You don't have to be familiarized with all these concepts. You simply just have to be there and provide your time, because that's what made the work in Birmingham that you mentioned, Leon, so effective, is that people just wanted to help, because at the end of the day, they will spend just even a couple of hours that they have helping.
So yeah, there's like tons of thoughts that come out of that, but I'm going to try and make it a linear thought process. I'm going to start off with a little history thing and say, like, I think there's an outcome here, but again, I think this is a place really for discussion and to put out ideas and to not provide solutions. I think that's one of the failings of the movement generally, is we're all like sci-fi nerds, developing our favorite alien planet or something. We don't know. We will learn by doing. We're human beings. We haven't perfected a system that we can organize in yet. We have often, though, improved systems that we live in, and we'll learn by doing. To exemplify that, I talked about the Stop the War movement, which was an awful, miserable waste of time and potential. I don't think the country's ever been so united on an issue. I think it was 90% of people opposed the invasion of Iraq. To waste that consensus within the nation on a movement that did not manage to achieve anything really scarred people who entered into it in good faith. And so what comes around is organizations like Climate Camp that come out in that interim period out of Stop the War. And there's a sort of underlying understanding that we'll never allow a leadership to tell us what to do again and lead us down this path. And so what you get with the student movement is the next flashpoint where you get basically a society-wide consensus. Tripling tuition fees is wrong. It's just wrong. It's exactly the opposite of what was promised by the people who'd got elected. It's wrong. But the movement in occupations across the country specifically fought those groups that had run Stop the War and said, you're not running these occupations, you're not running this movement. And actually, to be fair to the student movement, even though it was a failure, it was a lot closer. It was one vote in Parliament in the end, which was a lot closer than the Stop the War vote, and was a lot more dynamic. The protests and the demonstrations were a lot more aggressive and stuff like that. But we saw the limits of it. It couldn't bring in lots of new people. There was a trade union march and other things like that. And the low point is Occupy. And the reason I mention all these things is because the term diagonalism was brought to me by someone who was a Leninist, who was in the Socialist Workers' Party, who'd been in climate camp. And he said to me, he said, look, we've proven verticalism has failed. And I'm with everyone who's in climate camp, but we've also proven horizontalism, long decision making, invisible structures, blah, blah, blah. That's failed. So we need a new diagonalism, that dynamism, but bounded by something, by a structure, but not too structured and not based on a leadership. And there was sort of thoughts around that. There's organizations that come up like Plan C and stuff like that, where they're trying out sort of new models. But ultimately, the lure of something that's just like clearer and simpler becomes too great. And organizations like Novara Media go up and cover IndieRef in 2013, 2014. And loads of people go, the SNP, right? Brilliant. And then we need an SNP in England and Wales. So we'll join the Green Party. And then there's a Green Wave. Oh, well, that didn't do anything. We'll join the Labour Party. And so we repeated some old stuff. And that's all understandable. We learned a lot inside of that. Momentum experimented with new democratic structures and all of that. And I think our big task now, and the listener's task and everyone here's task, is to go, okay, can we have the dynamism of something that is not hugely structured, that is not reliant on a leadership that tells you what to do, but at the same time gives people who don't have much time something clear, at least to begin with, that feels meaningful to do when they join. It's not about it being easy or simple, but meaningful and is understandable what it is. So like with the mutual aid network, it's like, yeah, we're going to go out, we're going to give food to people, we're going to create food for people. It's not easy. You don't have much time. You've got to learn how to mass cook, but it's an understandable, it's a clear action with an outcome. Do you know what I mean? Can we build that level in and then say, but it's almost like a diagonalism. You start going up some stairs and you can be like, well, now it's clear how to get more involved. I really enjoyed doing that. And actually, I'd quite like to be more involved in how you make decisions and what you do. And it sounds like there's quite a few suggestions in the article, like rotation of roles, which some people tried to bring in climate camp before it collapsed. And I thought that was actually a really good idea because it stops people becoming a specialist and for their own sake, crushing themselves with the expectation that they've got to be the best treasurer, logistics manager, campaign organizer, or whatever in the organization, because they're the only one that can do it. And I've seen organizations that I'm part of now that specifically say every role is maximum 2 years or maximum 1 year. And you do that, especially with campaigns organizations. So you tell everyone that, like, I'm only going to be doing this for a year, so you better start thinking now which of you is going to want to take over. And the final thing I'll say in a practical sense is that I've seen this start to be discussed at the beginning of meetings. The beginning of meetings, they say, this is how the group works, and this is who's doing everything now, but they're only going to be doing it for X amount of time. And so you come into a thing thinking, well, great, I want to help. Okay, I've got something clear to do, but I better maybe think about helping out because they're not going to be doing it any longer. And that's just a couple of little takeaways that I've thought of.
I'd say, like, on a broader level as well, a learning that I've come away with partly from this article, but mainly really from being involved in activism and organizing, is just that no structure is ideologically perfect. And I think that's where, like, sometimes we get stuck being like, no, this is the good way to organize. This is like the truly radical way to organize. We have to have it be consensus decision making, or it has to be no one has a specific role because that means we're really, really good radicals. I think it would be so helpful on the left to let go of that idea. And that doesn't mean that we stop thinking about structure. That's super important, thinking about the way that we structure ourselves and the way that we manage power within organizations. But it means that we give ourselves more space to experiment and try things out and then come back and be like, this didn't work, or this is working really well. And we're not necessarily attaching different types of structures to different ideological positions, although obviously we should be understanding the relationships between structures and ideology as well. But there's a balance there, I think.
So true. Probably one of the major flaws of the movement is moral righteousness about anything that we do. Like, it's wrong to buy stuff. You're all evil. You know, we need less people on the planet. That's a dangerous element of deep green radicalism. But just generally a lot of finger wagging. And yes, whilst there are ideological bents that are behind one thing or another, really what we're trying to create is a world where we all have more control over our own lives, because that's really the only way to create a more just world, a more humane one where people have better access to the resources they need, and where we don't destroy the very thing that we live on and all of the outcomes we want to see. We need a world where we have more control, and we're going to have to experiment a bit, and we're not going to have to be like, this is the only way to do things. And that's very much what consensus was. This is the only way to do things, and people who don't do this are bad, because that was very much there. And I'm very much one of those people that was doing that. So like,
Yeah, me too.
I'm telling off. Yeah.
Yeah, no, divorcing morality from a lot of ideas is sometimes helpful. It's not to say we're negating it completely, right? But like, placing yourself on a moral high ground isn't not the best thing to do, right? And it makes people see you as a cunt, because you are. You just are. There's no debating that. You just are. And I've acknowledged that now. Like, I'm just acknowledging I am. But let's go do something. Let's go change something. Let's go actively be something. And let's create that change. And let's acknowledge these things and learn by doing. I love that phrase, because we keep learning by doing. And that's exactly what you're saying, Una. And also something that stuck out to me was this word perfection, right? On both like a personal and philosophical level. Like, I don't think that's a thing. We're different people from different contexts. We can't all be doing the same thing, because it doesn't make sense at all to have some one universal way of living and doing and being. It's just about working towards what works for us. And again, creating the world that we wish to live in. So thank you very, very much for sharing that, Una. And thank you everyone else for your reflections. It's been really, really lovely. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful evening following this. As always, make sure to check out our socials, especially our TikTok. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, and keep up to date with our future episodes. Empower, Love, and Rage from the Breathe Network.